Long before Mobutu Sese Seko became one of the most feared and powerful men in Africa. Long before his face stared out from banknotes and government buildings. Long before his voice boomed across radio waves demanding loyalty from millions. He was just a boy, born into a land that did not belong to its own people. On September 14th, 1930, in the remote river town of Lisala, in northern Congo, a child was born who would one day shape the fate of an entire nation. His birth name was Joseph Desire Mobutu. The Congo at that time was not free. It was not even a normal colony. It was a territory whose wealth and labor had been drained for decades by foreign rulers, first under King Leopold II of Belgium, and later under the Belgian state. Though the worst atrocities of Leopold's era had passed by the time Mobutu was born, the scars remained everywhere. Broken communities, poverty, fear, and a rigid racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. Mobutu's family lived in this system. His father, Alberic Gbemani, worked as a cook for Belgian colonial officials. It was a lowly position, but it gave the family something rare in colonial Congo: proximity to power. His mother, Marie Antoinette, was a hotel maid, cleaning rooms used by Europeans who lived in comfort, unimaginable to most Congolese. From an early age, Mobutu could see the difference between those who ruled and those who served. He saw how white men commanded and black men obeyed. Those images would stay with him for the rest of his life. When Mobutu was still young, tragedy struck. His father died, leaving Marie Antoinette alone to raise him. Life became harder, but she was determined that her son would not be crushed by the colonial system. She believed that education was the only escape from poverty. So she sent him to Catholic mission schools, run by Belgian priests. These schools were designed to produce obedient African workers and clerks, not leaders. Students were taught to respect authority, to serve Europe, and to accept their place in the world. But Mobutu did not accept it. He was intelligent, confident, and sharp-tongued. He learned French quickly, which was rare and powerful in the Congo. But he was also rebellious. He questioned rules. He talked back. He refused to behave like a submissive colonial subject. Eventually, his behavior got him expelled. In the Belgian Congo, expulsion was dangerous. A young African man without school or work could be arrested, forced into labor, or disappear into the colonial prison system. To save him, his family made a decision that would change history. They enrolled him in the Force Publique, the Belgian colonial army. At 19 years old, Mobutu became a soldier. The Force Publique was not a normal army. It was the iron fist of Belgian rule. Its African soldiers were commanded by white officers and used to suppress revolts, protect mines, and maintain colonial order. Many Congolese feared it, but for Mobutu it was an opportunity. He was one of the few recruits who could read and write French. That made him valuable. Belgian officers noticed him, they promoted him, they trusted him with responsibilities that other African soldiers never received. Inside the army, Mobutu learned more than how to shoot and march. He learned how power really worked. He saw how discipline created obedience. He saw how force created fear. And he saw how fear created control. These lessons would become the foundation of his future rule. At the same time, Mobutu was developing another side of himself. He began writing. Using a pen name, he published articles in newspapers and magazines. He wrote about politics, about Congo, about Africa's future. He read about independence movements in other countries. He followed the rise of African leaders who were challenging European rule. By the late 1950s, Congo itself was beginning to change. Nationalist movements were growing. The Congolese people were demanding independence. One man stood out above all others: Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was not born into privilege. He was born into poverty, like Mobutu. But he was gifted with extraordinary charisma. He spoke with fire and conviction. He talked about dignity, unity, and African self-rule. He became the face of Congolese nationalism. When Mobutu met Lumumba, he was drawn to him. The two men formed a relationship that would shape the destiny of their country. Mobutu became Lumumba's secretary and political aide. He helped write speeches. He organized meetings. He traveled with him. When Belgium finally announced that Congo would become independent in 1960, Lumumba emerged as the leader of the nationalist movement. In the elections that followed, Lumumba became prime minister of the newly independent Congo. Mobutu was rewarded for his loyalty. At just 29 years old, he was appointed chief of staff of the Congolese army. This made him one of the most powerful men in the country overnight. He now controlled the guns, the soldiers, and the force that could make or break any government. But independence did not bring stability. It brought chaos. On June 30th, 1960, Congo became free. The Belgian king attended the ceremony. Lumumba gave a fiery speech denouncing colonialism. The crowd cheered. The world watched. But behind the celebration, the foundations of the new state were weak. The Congolese army mutinied within days. Soldiers demanded higher pay and the removal of Belgian officers. Belgian civilians fled in panic. Belgium sent troops back into the country, claiming to protect its citizens. Rich provinces, especially Katanga, tried to break away to protect their mineral wealth. Foreign companies backed these secessions. The new Congolese state began to collapse before it had even fully formed. Lumumba, desperate to keep the country together, turned to the United Nations for help. When the UN refused to crush the secessionist provinces, he made a fateful decision. He turned to the Soviet Union for assistance. That one move changed everything. In the context of the Cold War, asking the Soviets for help was seen in Washington and Brussels as an unforgivable act. To the United States and Belgium, Lumumba now looked like a potential communist ally in the heart of Africa. They feared that Congo's vast mineral wealth might fall under Soviet influence. They decided that Lumumba had to be removed. They needed someone inside Congo who could do it. They turned to Mobutu. Mobutu was young, ambitious, and in control of the army. He had connections to Western intelligence. The CIA began funneling him money. Belgian officials began advising him. Quietly, carefully, Mobutu began to shift his loyalty away from Lumumba. On September 14, 1960, Mobutu made his move. He announced that the army was neutralizing the politicians. In reality, it was a coup. Lumumba was placed under house arrest. His supporters were sidelined. Mobutu claimed he was saving the nation from chaos. In truth, he was stepping onto the path of power. Lumumba tried to escape to rally his supporters. He was captured. In January 1961, he was handed over to his enemies in Katanga and brutally murdered. His body was dissolved in acid. The man who had dreamed of a free and united Congo was gone. Mobutu had not pulled the trigger, but he had made it possible. And from that moment on, he was no longer just a soldier. He was a kingmaker. The murder of Patrice Lumumba in January 1961 did not bring peace to the Congo. It brought silence. a terrifying, hollow silence that followed the removal of the country's most powerful voice. Lumumba had been more than a prime minister. He had been the symbol of Congolese independence. When he was killed, the dream of a free and united Congo died with him. And in that vacuum of leadership, one man quietly grew stronger. That man was Mobutu. Officially, he was still just the chief of staff of the army. He was not president. He was not prime minister. But everyone in Congo understood the truth. Whoever controlled the army controlled the country, and Mobutu controlled the army. After Lumumba's death, Congo descended into what historians would later call the Congo crisis. Rebel groups fought the central government. Provinces tried to break away. Foreign mercenaries roamed the countryside. United Nations peacekeepers were deployed, but they were overwhelmed. The state was breaking apart. Mobutu watched it all with cold patience. The politicians argued iron. The rebels fought. Foreign powers interfered. And through it all, Mobutu's soldiers remained the only organized force in the country. Behind the scenes, Mobutu was being quietly supported by the most powerful forces on earth. The United States, terrified of Soviet influence in Africa, saw him as a reliable ally. The CIA provided him with money, advice, and protection. Belgian intelligence did the same. They did not care that Lumumba had been murdered. They cared only that Mobutu was anti-communist. While Congo bled, Mobutu grew richer and more powerful. Between 1961 and 1965, Congo went through a series of weak civilian governments. Presidents and prime ministers came and went, but none could restore order. Every leader depended on Mobutu's army to stay in power. That made Mobutu untouchable. He began appointing loyal officers to key positions. He built a network of men who owed their careers and their lives to him. He also began secretly transferring money into foreign bank accounts. Even before he became president, Mobutu was already thinking like a ruler who expected to stay forever. By 1964, Congo was collapsing again. A massive rebellion known as the Simba Uprising swept through large parts of the country. Rebel fighters took over cities. European hostages were captured. The government was paralyzed. Mobutu presented himself as the only man who could save the nation. With American and Belgian backing, he crushed the rebellion. Western paratroopers were flown in to rescue hostages. Mobutu's soldiers retook cities. The government survived, but it survived because of him. Now, Mobutu knew the moment was approaching. The politicians were weak. The people were desperate. The army was loyal. All he needed was the right excuse. That excuse came in November 1965. The president at the time, Joseph Kasavubu, and the prime minister, Moise Tshombe, were locked in a political battle. The government was paralyzed. Nothing worked. Salaries went unpaid. The army was restless. Mobutu moved quickly. On November 24, 1965, he went on radio and announced that the army had taken power to restore order. Parliament was suspended. The Constitution was put on hold. Political parties were banned. There was almost no resistance. Mobutu had just carried out his second coup. This time, he did not step back. He became president of the Congo. At just 35 years old, Mobutu is now the absolute ruler of one of Africa's largest and richest countries. The United States immediately recognized his government. France recognized him. Belgium recognized him. Loans and military aid poured in. To the West, Mobutu was not a dictator. He was a strong man up, and in the Cold War, strong men were useful. Mobutu wasted no time consolidating his power. He purged the army of anyone who might oppose him. Officers who had once supported Lumumba were arrested, exiled, or killed. Civil servants who questioned his authority were removed. Journalists were silenced. Newspapers were shut down. Radio stations became tools of the state. Mobutu created a one-party system. His party was called the Popular Movement of the Revolution, or MPR. Every Congolese citizen was expected to join it. It was not a political party. It was a loyalty test. If you were not in the MPR, you were not safe. Slowly, the Congo became Mobutu's personal kingdom. But Mobutu did not just want power. He wanted worship. When Mobutu seized full power in 1965, he was not yet the towering figure history would remember. He was still Joseph Desire Mobutu, a young general with a sharp mind, foreign backing, and a nation in ruins. But he understood something few African leaders of his time truly grasped. Raw power was not enough. To rule a country as large, diverse, and unstable as Congo, he needed something stronger than guns. He needed myth. Mobutu began by eliminating every remaining rival. Anyone who had been close to Patrice Lumumba was viewed with suspicion. Politicians who had once held power were arrested or forced into exile. Some disappeared, some were executed, others were simply erased from public life. Newspapers were taken over by the state. Radio became the voice of the president. Schools were told what to teach. Churches were warned not to interfere in politics. Very quickly, Congo became a one-man state. But Mobutu did not want to rule as just another African dictator. He wanted to be something larger, something symbolic. He wanted to become the embodiment of the nation itself. In the early 1970s, he launched what he called the Authenticity Campaign. This was not just cultural reform. It was political theater on a national scale. Mobutu declared that Congo had been mentally colonized by Europe. He said African people had been taught to hate their own identity, their own names, their own traditions. He promised to restore African pride. Then he changed everything. Cities were renamed. Leopoldville became Kinshasa. Stanleyville became Kisangani. European street names disappeared. Christian names were banned. People were forced to adopt African names. And Mobutu changed his own. Joseph Desire. Mobutu became
Mobutu Sese Seko Kukumbendu Wazabanga.
It meant the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. With that name, Mobutu turned himself into a legend. He stopped wearing Western suits. Instead, he wore a leopard skin cap and a custom jacket called the abacoste, short for a bas le costume, down with the suit. This became the official clothing of the nation. Neckties were banned. European fashion was declared un-African. Mobutu was no longer a president. He was a symbol. In 1971, he changed the name of the country itself from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Zaire. He said Congo was a colonial name. Zaire, he claimed, was African. From that moment on, everything in the country revolved around Mobutu. Every radio broadcast began with his name. Every schoolchild learned his story. Every office displayed his portrait. Before news programs began, a video would appear on television showing Mobutu descending from the clouds like a god, waving to the people. The message was clear. He was not just a man. He was destiny. But while Mobutu built this grand image of African pride, something far more sinister was happening behind the scenes. He was turning Zaire into his personal bank account. Mobutu nationalized foreign-owned businesses and mines. In theory, this was supposed to return wealth to the people. In reality, it placed the entire economy under his control. He then handed these companies to his relatives, his friends, and his loyal supporters. They had no experience. They stripped the companies of assets, stole money, and let them collapse. The country's vast mineral wealth, copper, cobalt, gold, diamonds, flowed directly into Mobutu's hands. Foreign aid poured in as well. The United States, France, and Belgium sent billions of dollars in loans, military equipment, and development funds. Almost none of it reached the people. It went into Mobutu's private accounts in Switzerland and offshore banks. He built palaces across Zaire. He bought villas in France. He owned luxury apartments in Belgium. He had a private Concorde jet. Mobutu lived like an emperor. Zaire lived like a beggar. By the late 1970s, Mobutu was one of the richest men in the world, but his country was collapsing. Roads fell apart. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Teachers went unpaid. Soldiers survived by looting civilians. And yet Mobutu's power seemed unbreakable, because the Cold War was still alive. To the West, Mobutu was not a tyrant. He was a shield against communism. Zaire was strategically located in Central Africa. Mobutu allowed the CIA to operate freely in his country. He supported anti-communist forces in Angola. He served as a regional strongman for Western interests. As long as he opposed the Soviet Union, his crimes did not matter. People were tortured. Opponents were killed. Billions were stolen. But no one stopped him. Mobutu had built a dictatorship protected by the most powerful countries on earth. And for a time, it looked like nothing could bring him down. By the late 1980s, Mobutu Sese Seko had ruled Zaire for more than 2 decades. His image was everywhere. His voice dominated the airwaves, and his name was synonymous with power. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed empire, rot had set in. The country was bankrupt. Years of corruption, theft, and mismanagement had destroyed Zaire's economy. Roads were impassable. Power grids failed. Hospitals had no electricity. Doctors had no medicine. Teachers had not been paid in months or even years. Soldiers were unpaid and undisciplined, surviving by extorting civilians. Entire ministries of government existed only on paper. Mobutu still lived in unimaginable luxury, but the state around him was collapsing. Then the world changed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War, the very thing that had protected Mobutu for decades, was over. Suddenly, he was no longer useful to the West. The United States and Europe began demanding political reform. They wanted democracy. They wanted elections. They wanted Mobutu to loosen his grip on power. For the first time since 1965, Mobutu was under real pressure. In 1990, he announced that Zaire would become a multi-party state. Political parties were legalized. Exile politicians returned. Newspapers reappeared. The people, long silenced, began to speak. What they said was dangerous. They blamed Mobutu for everything wrong: the poverty, the corruption, the suffering. Protests erupted in Kinshasa and other cities. Students marched. Workers went on strike. Soldiers mutinied. Riots broke out. Mobutu responded the only way he knew how, with manipulation and force. He played political factions against each other. He delayed elections. He appointed and dismissed prime ministers at will. He pretended to negotiate while secretly maintaining control. But time was running out. In the eastern part of Zaire, something even more dangerous was brewing. In 1994, genocide swept through neighboring Rwanda. More than 800,000 people were murdered in just 100 days. When the killing ended, hundreds of thousands of armed Hutu fighters fled into eastern Zaire. They used refugee camps as bases to launch attacks back into Rwanda. Mobutu did nothing. His army was too weak. His state was too corrupt. His attention was focused on his own survival. Rwanda and Uganda decided they would no longer tolerate chaos on their borders. They supported a Congolese rebel leader named Laurent Désiré Kabila. In 1996, Kabila's forces invaded eastern Zaire. Mobutu's army collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers deserted. Officers fled. Weapons were sold. Zaire's once feared military was now a paper army. Mobutu himself was gravely ill. He was suffering from advanced prostate cancer. He could barely stand. He was flown abroad for treatment while his country burned. As Kabila's forces marched across Zaire, city after city fell without resistance. The people did not fight for Mobutu. They were tired. They were hungry. They were done. In May 1997, Kabila's forces reached Kinshasa. Mobutu fled. He escaped the country on his private jet, leaving behind palaces, money, and a nation he had ruled for 32 years. Kabila entered the capital and declared the end of Zaire. He renamed the country the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mobutu was now a man without a country. He went into exile, first in Togo and then in Morocco. The man who had once ruled one of Africa's largest nations now lived quietly in a foreign land, dying. On September 7th, 1997, Mobutu Sese Seko died at the age of 66. There was no state funeral, no honor, no crowds. He was buried in a simple grave far from the land he had once owned. And what did he leave behind? A nation shattered by corruption, a government that barely functioned, an army that had become a criminal gang, a people traumatized by decades of fear and poverty. The wars that followed his fall would kill millions. Mobutu did not just steal Zaire's wealth. He destroyed its future. He rose from poverty to absolute power. He ruled like a king, and he fell like a thief in the night. This was the rise and fall of Mobutu Sese Seko, the man who owned a nation and left it in ruins.